All right, thank you everyone. So as you heard, my name is Mark Dalgleish and I'm here all the way from Melbourne, Australia. So I am awake for now, but we'll see how we go. I'm here today to talk to you about designing with React, and this follows on really well from Andre's talk, so thank you, Andre, for that setup there. So designing with React is obviously a big topic. I'm just going to scrape the surface of it and my experiences with it, and hopefully you'll take a few pointers from it. Now in Australia, I work at a company called Seek. You probably haven't heard of them, but in Australia, it is a household name. It's the leading job site there. Everybody knows about Seek. And a big part of the work I do there is in the space of design systems and the tooling around that to support the usage of design systems. Now, what would a design systems talk be without some sort of quote about what they are? Design systems are all about bridging the divide between design and development. But for me, really, ultimately, what I'm excited about is being able to design in the final medium. As someone who's very much interested in design and development. In fact, when I started my career in web development, the line between the two was somewhat blurry, and I didn't know which way I was going to go, and design systems is very much the way that I can kind of capitalize on that today. So designing in the final medium to me is what it's all about. We can do that in React because of the component model. It's very, very powerful. Andre talked at length about how much components enable this way of thinking. Because components let us build our own domain-specific language. We get to decide what the markup for our brand is, for our design language. We can work with designers in our teams, at our companies, to make sure that we're properly capturing the design intent as components. We're seeing this at scale across the industry. You've got things like Polaris from Shopify. All of these are open source. You can go check them out. You've got Lightning from Salesforce. You've got Carbon design system from IBM. And at Seek, we have our own that we've had for a number of years now, all built on React, Seek Style Guide. And this is something that proved its worth very early on, and it's become very popular within the company. Ours also is open source if you want to go check that out. But, and there's a big but with this, is an issue. This is still your design experience. You open up Sketch and you've kind of got this blank canvas, and you can kind of draw whatever you want. And all of that hard work that you put into your component system is kind of nowhere to be found by default. You might have some earlier Sketch designs in this case that designers have put together, but conceptually, in terms of getting things to production, those are early drafts, not the final versions. The final versions of our components are not to be found here. So what we need is a way of feeding back into design. This is a problem that our industry is facing. A lot of smart people are working in this space. The most notable of which that really influenced a lot of people's thinking, Andre mentioned it as well, is React Sketch App. This came out of Airbnb and John Gold's work there at the time. It looks something like this. So on the left there, you've got React code, and on the right, it's rendering into Sketch. Now, the catch here is that the code on the left has to be written in a platform-agnostic way. Effectively, it's like writing React Native code. You'll see it's made out of Vue and text nodes. At the bottom there, it's rendering a document, and all of these things allow you to render a Sketch file, which is really, really cool. So as I said, for this to work, it's kind of coupled to the tech choices that you make in your application. There's a more general purpose solution that's less coupled to those choices called HTML Sketch App. I find this one's actually a lot easier to use because you don't have to shape your app code around it. Basically, as long as a browser can render it, you can snapshot it and export it to Sketch. So we have a hidden route on our style guide that looks like this. It's all of our components and all of their notable states, top to bottom. Each of them is wrapped in a div with a data attribute that allows us to select them, find them, and convert them into Sketch symbols. This is done via the use of an open source command line utility we released called HTML Sketch App CLI. It runs Puppeteer behind the scenes for you and does it all automatically. You just point it at a URL, tell it where to write to on disk, and JSON files come out the other end, which can then be imported into Sketch. So you saw a bit of a taste of this earlier in Andre's talk. This is what a real experience for a designer is at Seek using this system. You'll see there when you go to insert, instead of working in raw, low-level primitives of shapes, you've got those high-level symbols. And each of those symbols, importantly, is following the design language rules that have been set in Seek Style Guide. So all those components and the various states are named in the exact same way that developers will find them in the code. So again, as Andre talked about, we've got that shared language between designers and developers being reinforced at that tooling level on a daily basis for designers. So what we're seeing here is this move towards designing with components and making sure that those components are shared across this boundary. This is something that people have done with clever tricks and mad science, with Sketch plugins and so on, but we're starting to see that this is moving into the realm of polished, production-ready products that are working this way from the ground up. The most notable in this space is, of course, FramerX. So what you're seeing here is a UI where you're dragging and dropping components into the frame. But what's important to note is that those components on the left are all written in React. You can go and look at the source code for them. You can play around with them. You can create new ones. You can publish them to a store so that you can go and download entire sets of UI components or publish your own if you've got your own design system. And it means that now designers and developers are not just sharing screenshots effectively of your components, but the actual real components and the props on the right-hand side. They are by far not the only people operating in the space. You've got Module Studio as well, building a product that looks like this. Interplay is another really good one. What I like about Interplay is that it's web-based, so it's much more fluid and integrated, I find. Integrates into GitHub and so on. And what you're seeing here is an actual usage of it with our design system. So we've been trialing this at Seek, and it's been working really well for us. So again, you've got those same rules of the components that you've defined in your system are available there on the left-hand side, and the design flow is much more tailored to your own specific design language rather than these low-level primitives. What I love about these tools, again, as someone who's interested in both sides of this, is that they're blurring the lines between design and code. They're really making it so that when we collaborate on our products, we're really sharing the same underlying toolkits. But what I want to highlight today is this question of what makes these design tools. What is a design tool? That sounds very philosophical. But to me, if I go down the list, the first thing to note is that they're easy to set up. And this is in stark contrast to a lot of our development tooling. Downloading a copy of Sketch is easy to get started, or if you're using a web-based equivalent like Figma, for example, there's no setup at all. You just go to a website and it's ready to go. Once you've got that tooling ready up and running, new documents are cheap. You can just create new ones on the fly. There's really no friction at all to creating new documents. And within those documents, the iteration is really fast. So if you've ever watched a designer work in a tool like Sketch, you'll see that it's all about iteration. It's about making an artboard and duplicating it and fanning out and trying 10 different things and seeing what sticks. And then refining until you start to land on something you like. And that's where the next step's really important, is that once you've got something that you like, it's really about sharing it with people. It's about making sure that other people in your team, other designers, developers, product people, and so on, everyone's getting some visibility into the ideas that you think are working well. So if you're working with something like Sketch, you can take that document, you can send it to someone via Slack. If you're using a web-based version like Figma, you can probably just use the built-in sharing system and send a link to someone. That's the beauty of the web, of course. And it makes the whole process really streamlined end-to-end. But what's interesting to me is that if you really think about it, these design tools are still working under the same assumptions. They're still kind of built on this foundation that, to me, is really where we were 10 years ago or more, maybe not so much where we are today. And that assumption is that code is slow. When I started my career in web development, this was true for web development. It was slow and it was arduous, and you had to know the low-level details of HTML and CSS and JavaScript at length, and you had to juggle those three technologies independently all the time. A lot of copying and pasting, very slow. If a designer watched you work, they would get very bored, right? Is this true anymore? So if you look out at web-based development tools, you'll see that we've been chipping away at this for a long time. JSBin has been around for a number of years now, and with zero setup, just opening a browser, going to a URL, you have a JavaScript REPL there on the left. You can just type out code, and it's running live in the browser because your browser can run JavaScript. And there's a console on the right, and we can console log things. So if you're teaching people how to code, the barrier to entry is so much lower than when I got started. You don't have to install anything here. RunKit is an interesting one in that it's integrated with NPM's website. So any NPM package you're looking at, you can just one-click go and start playing around with that package. No needing to set up a new project and download the specific version of the package and then import it and make sure that you're using it correctly. You just one-click and here you are playing around with Lodash right in the browser. Babel is another interesting one in that, they've got this challenge where they had to convince people that it's really not a big deal, the transformations that it's doing to your code, and they had to make people understand what's going on with their code. Now, Kent covered this earlier, which is great. This is kind of how I learned what's going on with JSX, because the Babel REPL lets you just type out a function that returns some JSX, or even just a raw JSX node, and you can see there on the right that it's turning into a react.createElement call. So all that scary magic that Babel supposedly was doing actually boils down to something quite simple, and this tool was really instrumental in making me understand that. And again, there was no setup. I didn't have to install Babel and set up an environment and then inspect the output. They realized that they can do this all in the browser because it's all written in JavaScript. TypeScript is following the same approach here, where I guess what they're trying to convince you here is, first of all, that TypeScript is approachable, but they're also trying to convince you that the transformations that it makes to your code are not that severe. You can see that the TypeScript on the left and the resulting code on the right, when you look at that code on the right is probably not too dissimilar from the code you would have written anyway, and that's really the point they're trying to drive home. And again, I didn't have to install TypeScript or set anything up. It's all ready to go right in the browser because it's all just JavaScript. CodePen is a much more visual version of this, where it's all about giving you those HTML, CSS, and JavaScript panes, along with a set of configurable preprocessors. And then you can see the output there at the bottom. And what's interesting here on the CodePen side of things is that they're much more about the community and making sure that when you build something interesting, you can share it with other people and iterate on their work and build new things. To the extreme end of this really blew me away when I saw it, as I'm sure it did for many of you, is Code Sandbox. So Code Sandbox takes this to the nth degree, where it's basically a full development environment in the browser. So it's got the code editor in the middle, like you would expect, and it's got the preview pane on the right. That's all pretty standard from what we've seen so far. But on the left-hand side, you can see we've got a full file system, basically. We can create new files on the fly. We can import them from each other. And there's a package JSON. You can go ahead and start adding dependencies here, and it will install them for you. When you're finished, you can share your work with others. There's a fork button, so people can go and take your ideas and build on them. You can create templates that you can share. So if you want to, in this case, there's a React Native for Web starter kit that you can just boot up and start playing with. A lot of people use this as a way to get people playing with their more complicated setups and boilerplates and frameworks, where it might involve multiple files. But again, no setup required. You don't even have to have something like Visual Studio Code installed. You don't have to have NPM or Node. Just open up a browser. Really incredible stuff. Now, if you think about these points that I highlighted about design tools, it's actually the same. We're seeing the same things applied here on the development side, where they're easy to set up. It's cheap to create new documents. It's really fast to iterate live in the browser. And when you're happy with what you're building, you can share your work really quickly and fluidly with others because it's the web. Just send them a URL. So how does this apply to design systems? How can we apply the same thinking to the world of design systems and component libraries that we work with every day? We have a bit of an ace up our sleeves in the React community because of JSX. The ability to declaratively lay out a set of components and not have to think about the implementation details of how we actually build up a UI imperatively behind the scenes means that that bridge between design and development can close to near zero while still talking in code. And that's really the key to what I'm excited about. Because I had this problem where the more I invested in our component system, I wanted to make it so that our component code was more approachable, that potentially non-developers could even play around with JSX. The language is so close to the way they talk in daily usage, as we heard from Andre, that it's really not that much of a stretch to ask them to put it in a JSX-like syntax. The hard part really is all the surrounding stuff. It's learning how to set up a development environment, how to manage Git. Once you create a document, how do I import React and export a component, and once I've exported it, how do I render it? There's a lot of setup to do. The actual JSX bit is really simple. That thinking, long story short, really led me to the creation of this tool, Playroom, that we've been using at Seek for quite a while now. And rather than tell you about it, I'm going to give you a bit of a live demo. So this is the Seek Style Guide website that you saw before. Now, it's very much your standard design system website where you can see the list of components here. So I can look at the alert. I can see the alert in the different states and get code snippets and that sort of thing. That's all very standard. But what's interesting here is that we've got this Playroom link live here in the browser. So again, without any setup, I've got this design environment here. It's very much trying to look like Sketch, although it doesn't look so great on this monitor. The top section is more of a gray, not a white, but here we go. So at the bottom there, I can start typing JSX. Now again, that's the key thing, is I don't have to type React code or JavaScript per se. I'm really just writing JSX. So I'm going to add a header component to the page. And as easily as that, it's gone and rendered our standard header across the top. And it's responsive, so you can see we've got a pane there at 320 pixels, 740, 1024, and it's interactive. So I can click to expand this header. I can set my authentication status, for example. So I've got autocomplete that's powered by prop types or TypeScript if your files are written in TypeScript as well. So let's set the authentication status to authenticated. And then I'm going to set my username to Mark, and there we go. So now I'm logged in, I've got my name set there at the top there. When I expand this, it's as though I was signed into our website. Now, what I'm going to do is add a footer as well, and we've set that basic frame of a Seek page with very little ceremony, no setup, and even some nice tricks around the fact that I'm currently providing 2 sibling nodes. Behind the scenes, we wrap it in a React fragment, so I don't have to think. You think about a designer, if you taught them the basics of React, they'd probably trip over this straight away. They'd say, how come I can't just render a header and footer? And you'd say, I haven't taught you all the tricks yet. We try and make sure that this is as streamlined as possible. Okay, so we've got that frame of a page. Let's add some text to the page. So we'll add a text component, and we'll say sign in. That text is very small, so what we're going to do is we're going to change the size. And again, here's the auto-completion for the size of our text. We're going to say hero. Now, at the moment, that text is hard up against the edges of the screen. That's because we need to manage the white space. So I'm going to add a section component. Whoops. And let's wrap that around there. And it's all in one line, so what I'm going to do is format it. So we've got the sudo save, where I command S. It formats it with prettier in the browser, if that's what you want to do. And so there we've got our basic sign-in header at the top. Let's flesh this out a bit more and do our hello world of a sign-in form. I'm going to add a card to the page. And then I'm going to add a section, to manage that white space. And I'm going to add a placeholder text field. Let's format that. Okay, so that text field needs to have a label. Let's go ahead and do that. We'll say that the label is, of course, email address, and we will duplicate that, and we'll add another one, which, of course, would be password. Now, this is a real form. Obviously, it's not just a picture of a form, so I can interact with this if I want. Now, that password field, if we want to be nitpicky, let's say that actually is of type password and hide it. So as easily as that, it's maintained the state, and it's re-rendered, and that password is now blanked out. You can see that what's interesting about designing responsively, although again you can't really tell on the screen, is that that form is going all the way to the edges of the screen, and we might need to manage that. And at the moment, our component system really doesn't provide a good way for us to manage that sizing. So I might have to add a hacky inline style and say that the max width is, let's say, 540. You can't really tell on the screen, but the field doesn't go all the way to the end now, and that's particularly noticeable as I scroll across and look at the 1024 wide version, which that form starts to look a bit ridiculous at full width. Okay, so let's round out this form by adding a button group, and we're going to add 2 buttons. First of all, we're going to add a button that says submit. It has no styling by default. We have to tell it which color we want. Let's go with pink. That's our primary brand color. We'll add one more button, which is a cancel button, but we'll make this of type transparent. Cool. So there we go. There's our basic sign-in form. I could obviously go a lot further and have a remember me and so on. But you can see that in the same way that we saw earlier with these visual design tools, I had the same ability here, except it's projected across mobile and desktop simultaneously. And I'm being forced to use our design language with JSX in a way that really drives API design from the beginning. Now, the next step, of course, from here would be to start sharing my work with other people, as I said before. Now, you can't see it because I had it full screen the whole time, so let's drop out of there. Up here in the URL, it's a bit small, but there's a base64 encoded version of the code that's in that pane at the bottom. So if I was to take that, open a new tab, and I send that to someone on Slack, for example, and said, what do you think about this? They can open this up in their browser, and there they go. They've got that form that I just created. But it's not just a static picture, of course. If they want, they can start to play around with it. And let's say that the designer said, I don't want that button to say submit, I want it to say sign in. They can change the code if they want, start to play around and send it back rather than having to modify a picture. All right, cool. Now, as I said, this is a tool that we built. It's open source, so it's not just for us internally. This is available on NPM if you NPM install Playroom. It's a CLI tool, and there's two main commands to run, which is start and build. Start runs it up locally as a development environment, and build is what generates the static assets that you can then deploy to a website. So what we just saw before was hosted on GitHub Pages. It's as easy as running Playroom build and doing that. Just like all good JavaScript tools, it has its own config file. That's how this works. So the way you configure it is you pass it a file that contains all of your components or exports all of your components. That's how we know what to make available in that scope. So you don't have to import anything, as you saw. It also supports theming. So if you have a set of themes, you pass it a file that exports all of your available themes. You can configure the frame component that wraps every single iframe that you saw there. So that's where you might set any global context that's required for your app, particularly if you're doing things like theming. You might have to do that. You saw there that we had responsive width going across the screen. Those widths are configurable. So whatever widths you care about when you work, you can configure that here. That blank starting page that we saw before can be a bit intimidating. And sometimes it's nice to set up some example code when you start, so you can configure that as well. This whole tool under the covers is built using Webpack, of course. So that Webpack config, if you need to, is available here to extend it. So if you're doing anything fancy with TypeScript, for example, as we are in other places, you can configure it here. Now, I mentioned themes briefly. I want to go into a bit more detail about themes, because I think this is where Playroom really shines over alternative tooling, particularly with the work we're doing. And that's because at Seek, we're actually building a new design system to ultimately replace Seek Style Guide. And that's because Seek is actually the Seek group of companies. We have a number of brands that we look after. And so what we're looking to do is have the ability to build UI componentry or build pages that can be shared across all those brands simultaneously. At the moment, we have separate design systems that have been built in the different regions, and we're trying to bridge that gap with our tooling. So what I'm going to do is show you what Braid looks like. Here's the Braid website. Again, very much your standard design system website. The difference, of course, being that now you've got different themes for every single component. But again, we've got this Playroom link under tools. So here's a sign-in form, but rendered across the different themes, again, live in the browser. You'll see that the difference here between them is a lot more notable. So it's not just a simple palette swap, it's actually changing all the fundamentals of the design system, which has been a really good exercise for me, actually. Because these are pre-existing brands that we're having to merge into the one system. So they've got different typography, which is notable. But the typography is built on top of an underlying grid system, and that grid is different for every brand as well. And so that means that things like the height of text fields, the height of buttons, the space between things is all configurable, it's all different. And so you can imagine that when you start to look at traditional design tools, opening up Sketch, for example, and saying, okay, I want to design for 3 brands today, how are you actually going to do a realistic design across all those brands and get it right? It's actually really hard. And doing it in code, assuming you've got a good underlying system, is actually easier than using a tool like Sketch. And so this is where Playroom really starts to shine for us. But as developers, I think what's interesting is that you've got that obvious appeal of being able to expose your design system in a really approachable way. What I found interesting is how it's augmented our workflow as developers as well. So the first thing to note for me is that it's really impacted our development workflow, particularly on Braid, where the need to support multiple brands simultaneously is something you have to think about on a daily basis. So this is not uncommon to see at the moment if someone's working on Braid, typically across multiple monitors. But you would have your editor open in one window, and you'd have the browser open to Playroom in another. And what's happening here is there's actually kind of two things being juggled at the same time. You've got the developer iterating on the underlying code of the system, in this case changing some styling of a button. But then you've also got a real-world usage of the component in the context of a form. And you've got the code that drives that underneath it. So what we're seeing is a real push to think about not just is this component good in isolation, but how well does it fit into an overall system, and does it make sense when I combine it with other components? We really want to make sure that that design API is a first-class part of the design and development process, and we want to make iteration speed a real focus of our tooling. When we get closer to production, or production in the sense of a design system and releasing our changes, it's been really interesting to see how it's augmented our pull request workflow. So we're big on pull requests and making sure that everything goes through review, that every pull request gets built and tested. and up to the standards that we expect before we merge it into master. So here's a pull request that we had recently for a text field. Here's all the status checks for the PR, including a deployment of the preview site. So every single build of every pull request gets its own copy of the whole website, including Playroom. So that means that I can go and check out a snapshot of the work from this pull request and try it out for myself from scratch, just start to play around with it. So here it's a text field. I'm going to put that text field in a card. I'm going to add a prop to that text field of a label. We'll just say hello world. And I can see what it looks like across the different brands, and I can interact with it and get a feel for how well does it animate, how well does it interact. Now, if I jump back here, what's really nice is that the person who's authored this PR has kindly provided a Playroom example for me to try out, again, because the URLs are shareable. So here's an example, not just of a text field in isolation, it's an example of what a text field looks like in the context of a real form, where there's maybe multiple elements, and some of them have different labels. And I can start to have a play around with it, again, in the context of a real application, at scale, trying to build more realistic designs. How well does this stack up to my expectations of a design system? So this has been invaluable for us to get a feel for the new components coming in and to even push the boundaries of what they can do. We've discovered bugs via this process, actually being able to play around with that component. And what's funny is that as a developer, I'm very much set up to pull down the code, install the dependencies, build it, run it locally, and test it out. But in reality, I'm way too lazy to do all of that, right? What I want to do is just click a link and start playing around with the new version right away. And so that's become an invaluable part of our process. So it's exciting for me to see that what we've stumbled across is this idea of having a sandbox for our design language, something that requires zero install, zero setup, no building or running things locally, just open a link in a new tab and off you go. And doing so in a format that's really inviting for non-developers. Designers have started to play around with this tooling, and they find it really helps them understand what's going on in our heads as developers. Now, one thing I want to call out before continuing, I guess, is that I don't think this eliminates traditional design tools. What I think it does, though, is it reframes their purpose. We really have to think carefully about, in this new world of design systems, what are the tools supposed to do for us and at what stages in our workflow? UX people are really big on this idea of wireframing and have been for a long time. And I think they're onto something, this idea of saying that if what you're trying to do is quickly iterate on high-level concepts of what you're showing to a user, what screens are going to be provided and in what sort of workflows, this is the space to operate in. When you want to get down to the nitty-gritty detail of your design language, this is the space you should operate instead, which is to define that palette so that when you flesh out those wireframes, you've got this high-fidelity palette to work with, and you start to pick and choose those elements as you see fit to fill out those high-level flows. So practically that means that low-fidelity iteration should be on paper. If you want to move fast, do it on a piece of paper with a pen, and we can translate that quickly into code. And once we get there, that high-fidelity iteration should be in code. Again, with the assumption being that we have a system that we're building up over time so that we're empowering ourselves to iterate fast in high fidelity with the real thing in the final medium. So we're seeing the rise of code-powered design tools like FramerX and so on. But what I'm really interested to see is how we as developers can tackle it from the other side by having design-powered development tools that teach us design as we work and make us have workflows that are as streamlined and productive as designers, and making it so that every day when we go to work, we're thinking almost the way designers think and trying to make sure that our code actually supports us in that endeavor. So as I said, Playroom is open source, so if this is operating in a space that speaks to you, please do check it out, plug your own components into it, plug your own themes into it, try it out, try getting your designers to play around with JSX. I actually think it's possible. So please do that, check it out, let me know what you think, and together we can make it even better. That's it for me today. Thank you so much for listening.